All right, let's jump right in. Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving headfirst into one of the absolute most captivating, most famous, and honestly, most wildly misunderstood sound science stories out there, the Mozart effect. I mean, we've all heard it, right? The idea that just putting on a little classical music will somehow magically boost your brain power. But what does the actual science say about sound, learning, and memory? Let's take a look. So, does music actually make you smarter? Man, it is such an irresistible question. And for a long time, culture's answer was just this massive, resounding yes. It's this whimsical, almost magical idea that simply pressing play on a Mozart track instantly gives you a permanent intelligence boost. The concept literally spawned an entire industry. We're talking CDs for babies, endless study playlists for college students, the whole shebang. But to really understand why this idea took over the world, we have to look at where it actually started. Section 1. The Mozart Effect Myth, the origin of the hype. Okay, let's rewind a bit to see how a tiny scientific finding completely exploded into a massive cultural phenomenon. The year was 1993. Researchers named Rauscher, Shaw, and Kai published a study that basically changed how we talk about sound and the brain. They had college students listen to Mozart and then tested them on a spatial reasoning task. And guess what? The researchers reported that the students did indeed perform better. They showed a quick spatial reasoning boost after listening to the classical music. But here's the massive catch that the world somehow completely missed. The result was incredibly narrow, and the boost was only short-term. Because what's really interesting here is what that 1993 study actually did not prove. It definitely didn't prove a permanent intelligence increase. No way. It didn't prove that babies need classical music to get a higher IQ. And it absolutely definitely did not prove that throwing on a Spotify playlist can magically replace the hard work of, actually studying. But the media and marketing machines, they took that tiny short-term spatial reasoning finding and exaggerated it into a magical cognitive shortcut. Because let's face it, getting smarter just by listening to music is a pretty irresistible story. Which brings us to Section 2. The real science of sound, from magic to reality. Over time, our scientific understanding shifted pretty rapidly. We start with that really narrow original study in 1993. But fast forward to 1999, and a researcher named Shabriz comes along and conducts a meta-analysis, basically a massive review of a ton of studies. Shabriz found that the Mozart effect was actually really small. And more importantly, it was definitely not evidence of a general intelligence increase. The whole general intelligence theory was completely dismantled. And that paved the way for where the science sits today, which focuses entirely on something called the arousal mood explanation. And that leads us straight to the arousal mood hypothesis. This right here is the real core mechanism of what sound actually does to your brain while you're working. The basic concept is that listening to enjoyable, alerting audio might temporarily improve your performance simply because it changes your mood and your energy levels. Sound affects your alertness, your mood, and your motivation. If a sound makes you feel positive and pumped up, you might perform a little better on certain tasks for a very short window of time. But listen closely here, changing your energy state is absolutely not the same thing as permanently increasing your baseline intelligence. So the absolutely crucial point here is this stark contrast. The myth promised us a permanent intelligence boost, but the scientific reality? It's simply a temporary arousal and mood shift. Now, while sound isn't some magic study hack that's going to automatically hand you an A+, managing your arousal state is still incredibly important for how you perform day to day. Let's look at Section 3, How ASMR Changes State, the Modern Application. When we connect those older Mozart studies to today's world of background noise, it brilliantly illustrates how modern audio is actually a double-edged sword when it comes to studying. Today, so many of us use pleasant, nonverbal music or ASMR to regulate our moods. For a lot of people, it really effectively lowers stress and creates a sense of calm, which is obviously super helpful right before you learn. But check out these caveats. If the audio is too relaxing, you might just fall asleep. If it includes speech or lyrics, that's going to distract you from reading and impair your verbal learning. And if your background music is super complex, novel, or just highly interesting to you, it dramatically increases your distraction load and pulls your attention directly away from memory tasks. Ultimately, the effective background music depends entirely on the complexity of your task and your personal preference. Which means we kind of need to completely reframe our mindset. The best question to ask yourself isn't what sound makes me smarter. No, the much better, scientifically grounded question is, what sound puts my brain in the exact right state for this specific task? Let's move to section 4 to see how we apply this, designing your sound environment, the practical takeaway. So, how exactly do you match the right sound to your work? Look at how beautifully specific the science gets here. For math or visual problem solving, a lot of people do incredibly well with just instrumental background sound. It keeps your energy up without overloading your brain's verbal centers. But look at reading and writing. Because you're actively processing language, silence or a really simple nonverbal texture is much safer, mainly because lyrics will totally wreck your verbal learning. Trying to memorize something? The science says you should use enjoyable sound before and after to boost your mood, but test yourself in total silence during the actual active recall. And what if you're dealing with anxious studying? Try using some calming ASMR before the session just to lower the pressure enough so you can actually begin. So, pulling all of this research together, the real lesson here is pretty grounding. The Mozart effect became a myth because, frankly, we all wanted a shortcut. We wanted a completely passive way to get smarter. But safe, effective usage of sound isn't a substitute for things like active recall, proper sleep, or rigorous practice. Sound is simply a tool to regulate your mood. Your environment matters, your mood matters, your arousal matters, and your attention absolutely matters. If you take exactly one thing away from this entire explainer, let it be this one sentence right here. Sound is not intelligence. Sound is context. When you design that context well, your studying, your work, and your learning can feel significantly less chaotic. So, I want to leave you thinking about this. How are you going to design the sound context for your very next study session? Are you going to choose silence for reading, or maybe instrumental tracks for some visual problem solving? The power is literally in your hands to build your environment. So are you going to keep distracting yourself, or are you going to actually design your context? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I really hope this helps you optimize your learning space.